Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the founder and the host of the Rise About Justice Movement and the Rise About Justice Movement, the podcast. All right, so here we are with another addition to our candidate series, and this one brings a lot of energy. This one has a very powerful platform, brings a lot of energy, and I'm excited to welcome Shavonne to the podcast. Shavonne, I would love for you to begin by introducing yourself and kind of giving a backstory of what led you to running for office.
Well, hello, hello, hello. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate the space you are creating for grassroots candidates because Lord knows we need it. My name is Shavonne Hedgepeth. I'm currently running in Maryland's 4th Congressional District. I am originally from California, the Bay Area to be exact. And then I attended college in Atlanta at Clark Atlanta University, didn't finish there, but I learned a lot there. And I lived there for about 10 years. And then I moved to Maryland a little over 10 years ago. And I started my career in hospitality. So I'm a natural yapper. And then I transitioned into strategic communications, legal recruiting, and commercial real estate. And today I work at our transit system. So I like to tell people I'm just a girl who loves books, budgets, basketball, and Beyonce. Because who doesn't love Beyonce? It's a red flag if you don't. But I really wanted to run for office. A couple of years ago, I read this article about how Woodrow Wilson stagnated Black wealth in the DMV after he resegregated the government. And then lo and behold, what does Project 2025 tell us? They learned to do the same shit. So it really got me thinking about how reactive we are and have been as a party, because as a historian, this has been the same cycle since the Reconstruction era. And so we saw it with the backlash with, Black codes and the Jim Crow. And then we saw it again. We're going to jump a few years after Woodrow Wilson to Bill Clinton, and they had the trifecta. And there's like this massive wave of progressive ideology in Congress. And we passed a lot of progressive reforms. And then there's this massive backlash of conservative thought to try and, quell that ascension of like actually building a society that could benefit multiple groups of people and protect them from the harms that we're experiencing today. And then we saw with Obama, the same day he was sworn into office, the Tea Party, had all of their big rah-rah rules. And now, the Democrats run on trying to allegedly preserve, the Voting Rights Act and Roe v. Wade. And, and we're not doing that. We're running on fear. So I really wanted to kind of get in the race to protect our federal workers, protect our new Americans, and protect our queer community, because on International Trans Visibility Day, look what happened, because people aren't being targeted and what the impacts we're trying to drive in our communities. And that's kind of why I'm in the race.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll dive into it, but thank you for talking about j just a backstory because I think it paints a whole picture. And there's multiple different reasons for why people run for office, but a lot of these platforms come from personal experience, and thinking about that, let's kind of dive in and talk about Prince George County. Okay. On your website, you state that 17% of households experience food insecurity in 2022. And thinking about fast forwarding to 2024, 2025, and now 2026, thinking about this with a lot of the cuts federally to a lot of these social service programs, I do not call them handouts because they are not.
Mm-hmm.
I do not see them as that. I have relied on Medicaid. I have relied on food stamps. I have relied on my mom's SSI. I have, the working class like mindset, right? My grandfather was a union organizer. My grandmother was a badass human being. Both of them have passed away now. But
my condolences.
just thinking about, Prince George County, and thinking about, the food insecurity. How do we address food deserts? And I know that this hits really hard in like rural areas, but even a lot of grocery stores across the country have had to close their doors because of the rising cost. Inflation leads into that.
Yeah.
A lot just kind of goes into that, but let's address food insecurity and what it looks to to you, but also to like your constituents. 'Cause I'm sure that this is a deep concern. It's an absolute concern of mine.
Yeah. So, it's okay. I'm gonna ramble for like 2.5 minutes, so just rock with me. Um, Food deserts or food insecurity specifically, like let's root it in that first before we start talking about food deserts and food apartheid. Um, Food insecurity looks different across class spectrums, right? And some of it is a branding, right, or an unintended branding aspect, because a lot of people think food insecurity is I just have no access to food and I have to depend on assistance to be whole, right? But food insecurity also is deciding between, do I eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Or do I eat breakfast and lunch? Or do I eat lunch and dinner? Or how well rounded can my meal be? Or how healthy can my meal be? Or how far do I have to drive to get healthy food? How many stores do I have to stop at? Right. And then you layer in, if you're transit dependent, that becomes even more cumbersome. If you're working multiple jobs, then that becomes more cumbersome. So the default sometimes is I have to go with the easiest option. And sometimes we know the easiest option is the most unhealthy option, right? And then underneath that, you have the systemic disinvestment um, of food retailers in certain zip codes within Prince George's County. And so now that's where everything is resting. And there's a stark difference between 2022 and 2026 because the data that I have on the website is based upon 2022, and but more recent figures say that most houses they've surveyed, about 50% of them are food insecure, right? And when the government shut down, and as we all know in the DMV, the government is like this economic stabilizer, right? People work decades in the government, their families work in the government, and they have this access to stability that most industries don't provide. And that was severely compromised in the fall of last year. And so there were food handouts dedicated specifically to government workers where you literally had to show your ID or some form of it to verify that you were a government worker because they were impacted as well. So that illusion of stability starts to really pull away when you think about food insecurity. And so in Prince George's County, a lot of our food deserts are concentrated in the southern tip of the congressional district. And that has also historically been one of the most disinvested areas of the congressional district. And so what's important to also mention is the District 4 kind of operates inside the Beltway and outside the Beltway. And those are the very different class distinctions, but the one unifier across is food insecurity. And even when I was door knocking, I was in Fort Washington, and one of the houses I spoke to, they were kind of like, hey, yeah, my husband has to drive to Virginia to get food because there aren't enough options around here. And Virginia is relatively close to the southern tip of the district, but that is not how life should function, right? Like you should not have to weigh the cost benefit analysis of which grocery store I'm going to go to, how am I going to maximize what I'm actually able to afford. And during the pandemic, like I had to go to 3 grocery stores, right? Because of supply chain issues and just, trying to find items that I needed to actually be able to cook 3 meals a day because we were in the house. So we had to eat 3 meals a day if we could. But in terms of addressing it, we have to name the input that leads to food deserts, and that is, white supremacy and food apartheid, right? So when we're designing and we're planning around like urban development, we aren't considering the various factors within these different zip codes and how some get better development and how some get less development. And one of the biggest ways to fix that, which is under persistent threat, is USDA funding. And I think a lot of people don't understand or realize how much power Congress has. Like we push a lot of local offices and their impact, but the real goal of a congressional representative is to marry that federal funding to the vision of the districts that they're representing. And if we don't have the accurate picture of our district, then we can't adjust the inputs into the federal formulas to really drive that money home because we're not telling the full story. So in order to really address food insecurity in District 4, we would have to look at our formula funding levels. And so that we can ask for more money because you're only as powerful as you're funded, right? We know that about billionaires, but we don't look at districts the same way. And that's pretty much how they function. The more money you have, the more access you have to undoing systemic harms in marginalized communities and really getting closer to equity. But in this particular environment, it's going to be hard as hell because anything that alludes to equity is immediately dismantled. Um, so it's going to be an uphill battle of restoration as well as rebuilding, and I think that's the most viable way to look at it because with those the largest cuts to SNAP benefits in history, and the thing is these cuts they're hitting after the election, right? So if candidates aren't talking about it, it's not in the forefront of your mind. Like with Medicaid work requirements, that's hitting after the general election. So if you're not working with your people on the ground to make sure they have all the paperwork they need, they're going to lose their benefits. So it's a mixture of restoring what was lost and then really designing creative ways and innovative ways to rebuild our pathway towards like a more progressive society for the residents in any district that people are running to represent.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And thank you for addressing that too, because it's a very real need. And, people, quite literally starve to death. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a very real thing that's very highly overlooked. And you said a key thing about USDA funding. And I'm also thinking of more like the rural districts too, like
Yep.
these extreme food deserts where you
Mm-hmm.
have to
Mm-hmm.
drive and, you have to pay for gas, you have to pay for the groceries, and then you have to pay for the gas back. Like that can be a real cost burden to a lot of people, right? Um, kind of pivoting a little bit, and also another cost burden is housing. So,
Mm-hmm.
what does housing look like in your district? What is working and what's not working?
Oh, that's gonna be a hot topic, baby. You put me on the hot spot. Okay. Um, I'm trying to think of how I want to like tackle this so that way it doesn't turn into like a diatribe of like nuance. Um, right now, Prince George's in general struggles with affordable housing inside the Beltway, outside the Beltway, it doesn't matter, right? Um, and a mixture of that is because we don't really have like this really strong tax base. So the county heavily relies on property taxes in addition to like state and federal money, right? To close gaps, to be able to meaningfully develop things. So we have a influx of townhomes. And these aren't like starter townhomes. These are townhomes that cost close to $500,000. And so that prices out large swaths of people who may not want townhomes. And then abutting that, or, running parallel to that, we also have a housing shortage. We're about 4,800 houses short. And by houses, I mean like any living quarters, right? That we need to accommodate the people in our district. And then thirdly, we have a lot of people leaving the district because of the cost of living. And they're moving to neighboring counties like Montgomery County and Howard County. So we cannot keep up with the pace of the need in our area. And when they do keep up with the pace of the need, we're cutting off a large swath of the people that live here. And we're also extremely transit rich. We have ample opportunity um, to build out affordable housing through the guise of like transit oriented development, which is my favorite mechanism through federal dollars. Because you can write into your federal dollars like, hey, bro, I need some affordability options in there, and I need displacement protection, right? Because sometimes like what's get lost in the conversation with the housing shortage is how do we protect the people that are still here? How do we make sure that they can live in the city that they've contributed to and they've been living in for decades, right? While we have this advantageous goal of expansion. So it's really about being on the appropriate committees to write in there, this is what my district needs. These are what the other districts need in order to really achieve affordable housing. And, marrying that with what the county is doing. So Prince George's County did this study on missing middle housing. So instead of looking at apartments or townhomes or single family homes, they were like, how can we revise the permitting process to give other houses the opportunity to, kind of rent out a basement or rent out, these different aspects on their property or build out options for them to expand the inventory of housing. So because we're so behind our goal of 4,800 units at a minimum, um, we would have to get really creative in how we leverage our dollars at the federal level. But the gag is in the 27 budget that Trump is proposing, he wants to get rid of community project funding. He wants to further slash HUD dollars, right? He wants to further slash these dollars that everyone across America and their representatives rely on to helping to close the gaps around addressing our cost of living um, crisis and our access to what affordable housing will look like. And I don't know about you, but I would like to buy a house one day. You know what I mean? Like I would like to be able to buy something that I genuinely enjoy and don't want to have the concept of a starter home because that doesn't exist anymore. Starter homes don't exist. Either you go straight from apartments or you go straight to a $400,000 home, right? Or you have to buy something and then it undergoes massive renovations, right? So it's like we're being hit at all these different angles. And if we don't get the right people in the right rooms to tell that story and what it means for the people that they're representing, then we will not be able to really, really move forward and address that concern.
Which leads into my next topic and something that is not talked about very much at all is like the sickle cell research. And this aspect of healthcare is oftentimes overlooked. And I know
Mm-hmm.
funding has been astronomically cut in regards to research, not just with sickle cell, but also like cancer research and
Mm-hmm.
children. And there's been a lot of these devastating cuts. And one of the things that I think about is US aid. And I've
Mm-hmm.
connected with a lot of several like federal workers that were essentially doged
Mm-hmm.
as they as they state. There's a really good group of people on social media, and it's Friends of US Aid. They are incredible human beings. Like I said, they used to work for USAID for many years. And, shout out to them. We've collaborated with them, and they are a badass group of human beings because they actually give a damn about people. Gee, what a concept, right? But thinking about, healthcare, thinking about sickle cell research and tying in like Medicare for all, which I know you are in support of, thinking about that, how do we recognize sickle cell as something that we all should be aware about? And
Mm-hmm.
this disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities. Thinking about this, what are your thoughts about expanding the research and also, tying in Medicare for all? I know you're going to pop off on this, and I feel it, and I'm excited. I
it's
are
it's bubbling in my diaphragm.
I can feel it. I already know you got a lot to say about this. This is the
Yeah.
point. This is the question. They, feel free to ramble, and there is no limit. Well, okay, I'm gonna say, if you ramble for like 3 hours, we might have a different conversation. But, um, you know, kind of let it all out on this because it leads into, education about sickle cell, right?
Yep.
Education about healthcare. The for-profit healthcare system has deeply impacted all of us. So, you know, my friend, feel free to pop off here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate the permission. I think I'll tackle it one by one, right? So sickle cell, as we know, predominantly impacts, Black Americans. And I actually wrote a paper about sharing data research and federally funded research. It's called What About Your Friends? A trans disciplinary collaborative approach to federally funded research. Because a lot of times there are brilliant people, like you said, in these spaces who care deeply, deeply about people and trying to, bridge harms across that space. And surprisingly, sickle cell research is one of the few bipartisan efforts across the House and the Senate in terms of allocating research to it, but it's still significantly behind, other rare diseases. And there's a strong sickle cell warrior community here in District 4 because of the racial demographics. And I really got involved in it because I volunteered at a Sickle Cell Warriors 5K It was geared towards sickle cell warriors and their caretakers because sometimes when we talk about the health equity challenges across any rare disease, we forget about their loved ones and how they are just as in the community as the people that they're caring for and loving for. And I was like, what does like research in this space look like? I'm very nosy, or I'm very inquisitive. I'm very inquisitive. And so I had to go back and look at everything. And then I looked at the landscape in Prince George's County. And it's like, damn, we're in a healthcare desert. So it's not only are we in a food desert, right? But we're in a healthcare desert. So, and there's a shortage of adult hematologists. And so I started going to policy briefings to understand like what's the work in this space? What does it look like to actually make some change here? And, underfunded research around Black and Brown issues is not a surprise to me because everyone knows about ALS, right? Everyone knows about Crohn's disease, and they impact significantly fewer individuals in some cases. But because of who it impacts, it does get amplified to different level or different magnitude. Um, and to really close the funding gap around that is going to be an insane hurdle because it's a messaging piece um, that has to require people to care about something that doesn't impact them, and that is not the American way. Right? We're very individualistic in what we care about and who we advocate for, except for the people who are in these spaces doing the things that you're doing and doing the things that the U.S. aid workers were doing. So it would have to be a targeted effort to restore that federal funding and then making sure that you have the healthcare infrastructure to sustain it. Because the one big beautiful bill, and sidebar, I know people call it all these wonky things, but I believe in naming a monster what it is, right? And it's the one big beautiful bill. If that's how he wants to brand it, then we're going to talk about all the ugly things about it because we can run into the issue of rewriting history and naming the things that actually caused us harm. And that completely gutted pathways towards doctors and nurses. So you're dealing with the infrastructure challenge, you're dealing with the federal funding challenge, and now you're dealing with the personhood challenge. So all of that has to be rebuilt. And all that has to be rebuilt in the name of creating pathways to solutions for all members of rare disease communities. But I will say, and this is not a popular thing, so I know I may get some hate, and I hope this doesn't get directed at you, but a lot of that cost burden has been picked up by pharmaceutical companies. A lot of the advancements in sickle cell cures, because there is a cure out there for certain types of sickle cells, and it has been given out. That person actually lives in the DMV area, and the pharmaceutical company has carried that mantle over the finish line for sickle cell research. My friend, she has multiple sclerosis, and she was diagnosed while we were in school together. And she lives at that intersection of she doesn't make enough for Medicaid, or she makes too much for Medicaid, but she makes too much money to really get any assistance. And so the pharmaceutical company that's providing her therapy closed those gaps for her. So everything that she needs is being provided by the pharmaceutical company because our healthcare system can only think about you in one or two ways. So really expanding the legislation around it. Like I know that we're going to talk about this, but Lauren Underwood has done an exceptional job with the Momubus. It's like 17 separate pieces of legislation that addresses Black maternal mortality. And she's been able to piecemeal it out and get that messaging in front of the right committees and in the right places and get that funded. So the most reasonable path forward to really closing that gap is refunding research. That's number one, right? And closing the gaps that the pharmaceutical companies have been forced to close and kind of live within to keep these communities safe. Because after 18 years old, most sickle cell warriors, they encounter extreme food insecurity. They encounter an extreme drop off in wellness care from a mental and social perspective because they're cut off from the access to the programs that have literally been keeping them alive until they were 18. So there are a lot of gaps we have to close in that space. And the only way we can close those gaps is with money. And so that means everything will be built upon fighting to get that federal funding back, in which I said some of it does have bipartisan support. So it won't be like this massive lift in terms of closing those gaps. And then to the U.S. aid group, that I would say, and I'm not saying this in like a loose way, that's probably one of the worst cuts that we've encountered. under this administration because of how broad their democracy and their impact has been globally, right? Like everyone likes to think about how impacted we've been by these cuts, but oppressed communities around the globe are feeling the brunt of this administration in ways that we probably won't even begin to recognize until years down the line. And it's just time for us as a party, as a Democratic Party, to stop trying to manufacture fighters and really design strategy and solutions around what the hell we're going through right now. Because we didn't do it after Reagan, we didn't do it after Bush, we didn't do it after Woodrow Wilson, right? And so these cuts have much more detrimental impacts than I would honestly say Reagan at this point, right? Like I think we need more than what we're getting. And if we don't get that more after fiscal year 27, we probably won't be able to claw back this damage for at least 50, 60, 70 years.
And who knows where we'll be at that point in time because we didn't take care of it now. And it's important to get people who are going to address these issues in now to be sure we don't reach that point. So thank you for talking about that. Thank you for bringing that up. Some of the other cuts that we're seeing is to the Department of Education. And public education is deeply important to me. This is probably my one of my biggest talking points whenever, I'm on a podcast myself, whenever, and I talk about education on this podcast too. But whenever I'm being interviewed, I talk about public education very heavily because I am a product of public education. I
Mm-hmm.
graduated, class of 2015, and
You're a baby.
I'll be 30 this year.
You're a baby. Oh my God. Okay.
But thinking about the direct cuts to public education, thinking about how they are trying to gut it to the point where it does not function at all, which is
Mm-hmm.
intentional, and give
Mm-hmm.
that, quote unquote, give that power back to the states. We saw how well that worked with abortion rights. It didn't.
Mm-hmm. And in
Um,
Texas.
yeah, yeah. Just thinking about that, and I know you are a huge supporter of public education. What would this quote unquote like voucher scam look like in your district? And it's an attempt to destroy public education. It's an attempt to destroy the Department of Education. And I don't know about you, but I run my social media, and having close to 400,000 followers, and we have a tendency to go viral on a lot of posts. Okay. I'll be the first to say that. Even under like meta censorship, we do still get posts that tend to keep going. Sometimes those posts wind up on the wrong side of the algorithm. And what I mean is it brings out these bots, it brings out these
Yep.
trolls, it brings out these angry people. They all look the exact same. But just thinking about this, they are the exact reason for why we need public education. They are the exact reason for why the
Yep.
Department of Education needs to continue existing because they don't even know what the right to due process is. They sit here and talk about the Constitution. They sit here and talk about a number of different things, but they don't even know what the fuck they're talking about.
Not one bit.
And I'll be the first to say it. Like I said, they are the prime example for why the Department of Education needs to continue existing. But
Mm-hmm.
thinking about these cuts to education, what do you propose as far as like expanding public education? Because, like you said, these are very, very deep cuts. These are very, very deep cuts, but there's something that we can do. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on this.
You want to hear something hilarious as hell?
Oh, yes.
I actually wrote a paper about this shit too.
Yes.
Yeah, it's when I wrote a paper called American Requiem, um, the decline of social upward mobility and student loan forgiveness, because I'm a public school girly too. And I went to school in California and it was extremely, extremely, and I was always a year younger than everyone in my classes. So public school may have been a little different for me. And I had, big glasses, and so I credit my resilience to my public school education, and I credit my love of learning to the teachers that I've experienced there. Like Miss Hegenberger, I used to read through books like crazy. Like she started like just bringing me books like outside of the classroom because she fed into my appetite for learning because I was extremely, extremely curious as a child. And so I have a deep, deep personal connection to making sure public schools stay funded. But in the paper, I talk about the Department of Education and the Higher Education Act because we know what that was in response to, right? Prior to, segregate or reintegrating, integrating the schools, college was damn near free. You know what I mean? Like you could just, all you needed was a hope and a dream. And I remember one time, and this is after the Higher Education Act, but there was, when I was at my legal recruiting job, this applicant applied for, placement. And his letter was that he petitioned UCLA. He didn't graduate high school. I just want to say that again. He did not graduate high school. And this was in the early 90s. And he petitioned UCLA to let him in on a trial basis. Um, and they did because he wanted to prove that he could actually be, an exceptional lawyer, which he wound up being. But it's like the audaciousness is something that Black and brown people will never get the opportunity to achieve. And these cuts further stagnate any type of progress when it comes to education to begin with. And in my paper, I argued that public education is a public good. Just like they told us when, we had to bail out the airlines, that airlines are a public good and we had to give them all that damn money. Like my biggest concern about like conversations or my biggest gripe about conversations around like money and how expensive educating our kids are is we always have money for everybody else, but we never have money for American citizens. We always have money to bail out corporations. We always have money to bail out banks and airlines, right? And then allow the already wealthy people to purchase stock buybacks to get even wealthier. And we over here got to jump around from incognito window to incognito window just to buy some damn tickets. So when I think about what public education could be in this country, I wholeheartedly believe that it should be managed by the federal government, full stop. Like, can the state have some impact? Of course, right? But guidelines need to run concurrent across the nation because if we're telling different versions of the story, like they do in Texas, telling people that enslaved people were volunteers, right? Like that is the root cause of where we can exist today and how people navigate oppression in the country. But for Maryland specifically, it would devastate us. We are one of the most diverse public school systems in the nation. We would essentially be crippled because we would have to pass those costs down to our residents, and we're already struggling to maintain through the cuts right now. Now, obviously, states have to opt in, right, to the voucher program, but we it would require some of the most creative intergovernmental collaboration known to man. Like it would require being so in tune with your local leaders and your state leaders um, to implement and protect the students that I don't think we've ever seen it on this scale before. Um, so it's because Maryland has like this plan called the Blueprint for Maryland, and it's this really nuanced take on what education looks like specifically for Maryland public schools, and it's very expensive. It's almost $4 billion a year for 10 years, right? Um, and federal considerations were built into that plan, and so now that that is being gutted, that places the cost back onto our students. And the way that this administration is running through everybody's house like the Tomb Raider, um, it is. I'm trying to be like, how can I say this? We have to start calling out the people, not just who are doing it, but the people who are standing on the sidelines allowing it to happen. Because the memo's not going to cut shit no more, right? A cute headline is not going to cut shit anymore because it's people. There are people on the ground whose kids have to deal with this. The teacher shortage is already a challenge, right? We're already gutting that pathway towards stability for teachers. So it's interesting because people always talk about wanting to burn the system down so they can rebuild it, right? Like this is not Sherman. This is not the Civil War. there will be bodies under that rubble, and there will be bodies and casualties under that rubble that did not deserve it and did not ask for it and do not even have the capacity to understand it because people are just trying to fucking survive. Oops. Because people are just trying to survive in this particular climate. So, public education, restoring those cuts, rebuilding the Department of Education is going to be a diabolically strategic goal to do. But I live at the intersection of optimistic and pragmatic. Like one of my taglines for my campaign is hope and hustle, because people don't feel as though people understand what we need to do strategically. You can ask anybody running for office, what's their plan to rebuild anything, right? And nobody will have an answer because everybody just wants to run on value statements that sound nice to voters when we need to really be designing the same infrastructure that the Republicans have been building out since 1938. So being able to respond to what the cuts to Department of Education look like for Maryland, devastating. We probably wouldn't be able to recover for decades if it moves forward.
Don't feel bad about dropping a subtle F bomb. I'm just gonna let you know that right now. Do not feel bad about it. Um, but thinking about DHS and ICE, okay, you know,
Yeah,
I'm older than both. A lot of people that are running for office are older than both
correct.
because, thinking about, or yeah, I mean, it was created out of fear, allegedly created out of fear.
Unfounded. I was like, unfounded fear.
Literally.
Like a bunch of bullshit. Like, okay, sorry.
No, no, you're right. Exactly. 100%. Thinking about DHS and thinking about ICE, again, I've talked about it on a couple different episodes, but we saw what happened in Minneapolis with Alex Pretty. We saw what happened in California with Keith Porter.
Thank you.
Um, that one is very fucked up, to say the least, and is left out of the conversation. Now, thinking about DHS in your area and like ICE, do you have a field office in your district or like in your area? Do you have a
They're trying to
Mhm.
build one in Hyattsville, yeah. Like, but I will say this: Maryland is uniquely positioned because we have very close proximity to DC, and a
Mhm.
lot of our residents, especially in District 4, about 22% of our residents work in the federal government in various capacities, and or they are also contractors, right? So, but Maryland has done a really great job in their last session of protecting our new Americans and
Mhm.
stagnating ICE expansion in this area. Now, in other parts of Maryland, more rural parts of Maryland, they're running to a lot of challenges. And but what ICE means to me, or abolishing ICE, I think it's a natural condition of where we need to go as a society. But I'm going to take it a step back. The the violence that we're seeing in ICE was the same exact state sanctioned violence that we saw across the police force for decades. And because we've allowed anti Blackness to filter into all of these spaces and justify enforcement, I'm putting air quotes. I know we're audio, but I'm definitely putting air quotes because I'm not trying to indicate that that's what this is. That onus is on us as well, right? So ICE is a byproduct of fear, but it's also a byproduct of us never dismantling the racial prejudices of the police systems across America. And that is the reality that we also have to confront within ourselves. It's just the targets are different, right? Um, Police is predominantly black and brown, and this way it's predominantly brown and black, right? So they're in equal measures of violence, um, just on a much, much larger scale because it is federal. Um,
Mhm.
and secondary to that, we have not passed significant immigration reform. So, like, my biggest thing as a member of Congress, like, I'm dedicated to delivery, right? Like, it's not about what sounds cute in a headline. It's about what have I done in that room? What have I done on that committee? And can you tie a marginal difference between what happened in 2022 to me being in that seat in 2026? That is my only goal. And so we had bipartisan support. In fact, the Republican sponsors say, we got to pass this shit, big dog. Like, this is necessary. They had the Immigration Reform Act of 2024, and Trump uses it as political leverage to gut it because he wants to be able to say, like, Biden didn't do shit, right? And that's another problem is like we don't ever remind people what we've done. And so that's dead. in the Senate, even though it had the necessary support it needed to push through. So in the House, there's no comparable legislation because sometimes in the House, you can be like, oh, that's a really great idea in the Senate. It may have fallen out of the conversation. Let me write some shit to bring it back to the top, right? We haven't done that. So while everybody's running around responding to what ICE is doing in on their TikTok videos, on their Instagram, on their personal statements and their emails while they're asking for money, ain't nobody doing shit in the House about it, right? So we have to be honest about what abolishing ICE actually looks like because we can't abolish ICE and then allow a system that has people languishing who are going to court, doing the right thing, showing up on time, going to work, paying their bills, paying their taxes, and there's no pathway to citizenship for them, right? So we would have to do both. We would have to abolish ICE and we would have to rebuild our immigration system, which has obviously been gutted in this administration, right? And like last night, the Senate just passed through funding for at least the next 3 years or 10 years, 3 years.
The
I'll
next
just say
3 years. Yep.
3 years, right? So now anything that we wanted to do to fix and protect our new Americans and to abolish ICE and to reform the immigration system is a wash because we didn't do shit in advance. You know what I mean? It's been 2 years since
Mhm.
that bill has come through. And who's going to be worse for the wear? Our new Americans, right? Our neighbors. We have a very diverse district. I think we have the largest Latino population in Maryland, in Maryland, in District 4. I think we have about 27% of Marylanders in District 4 are new Americans. And we just pretty much said, sucks for you. We didn't plan to protect you. We knew what was happening. We've known about it for 3 years, and we didn't do anything to protect you because we wanted to be reelected. And we didn't want to, we didn't want to alienate certain people from the party. You can't even get them to talk about abolishing ICE, right? Because it would upset their donors. So the main goal, long story short, the main goal is to really be meaningful and intentional about reforming the immigration system as a whole. And then secondary to that, abolishing ICE. So that way we are not compounding a problem that will never be solved because it sounds nice to say you want to do something without addressing the root cause of the problem.
I love how you said same system, different tactics, because that's exactly what it is. And it's an oppressive state. It's a surveillance state. And
Surveillance, yes.
thinking about surveillance, we see a lot of the flock cameras, popping up in different areas.
Mm-hmm.
And this is deeply alarming. And there was a bill recently discussed in Congress and was voted on to increase the surveillance state. And it received bipartisan support. I believe 7 Democrats
Mm-hmm.
voted in favor of it.
Mm-hmm.
And those Democrats, one of them, Jared Golden, is no longer running for re-election. Thank God. Um, there's some really good candidates running in that district. He needs to go. He's an APAC, you know. Oh, there's
Who
all
isn't APAC funded at this point? Like if you in there,
you
baby,
got that right.
you got a little bit of money from there. So
You
I
got that
just
right.
yeah, I mean like using everybody's funded by APAC in some capacity, right? Everybody goes to Israel. Like everybody gets that money in some capacity. So I
And it's all
mean,
a choice. It is an absolute
it is.
choice. It is an absolute choice. So thinking about that, thinking about mass incarceration disproportionately affects marginalized communities, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And some more than others. I'm gonna let you obviously, take this away. Violence prevention, common sense gun reform. We learned about a very devastating situation that happened in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
Um, 8 children were killed in a domestic
Mm-hmm.
violence situation,
Mm-hmm.
in 3 separate locations. Some of the children were related to the suspect, which was shot and killed by police.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but thinking about mass incarceration, violence prevention, disproportionate policing, and like common sense gun reform, I know there's a lot to kind of like break down here, and I'm gonna let you kind of handle this however you want to do it,
Yeah.
but it's all connected. It's a part of the same systemic racism. Um, just thinking about this, what are your thoughts as far as all of this goes? This is also my favorite thing to talk about. So,
Baby, I can tell because you was ready. I can tell. So to ground the reality for like the people that I'm running to represent, right? Like Black people in Maryland make up 30% of the state's population, right? But 71% of the bodies in prison are Black bodies. So it's the nation's highest racial incarceration gap. So it's not a one off here in Maryland specifically, right? And when you think about our political landscape, most of our leaders are Black as well. So understanding that is a landscape that we are operating within, the path forward cannot be race blind. It has to be targeted specifically to the people who are most severely impacted by it. And so when it comes to what addressing that looks like, I will say there are a lot of brilliant people on the ground like doing this work. I have a friend; she actually used to go around to, um, the jails and register people to vote because a lot of people don't realize that if you don't have a felony, you can still vote, right? So like they wanted to still ensure they had dignity and agency. But in Maryland, they did pass a Second Look Act last April, I think, where if you serve 20 years or more of a sentence, like they'll be like, I mean, obviously they're cutting out like murderers and sex offenders, right? But it's like there is some pathway towards dignity again. Um, and to your point about what happened in Louisiana, in Shreveport, uh, there is a distinct correlation between rising economic crises and femicide. Like that is especially Black femicide, right? And in other cultures, they, kill themselves. But for some reason in America, they like to take out everyone. And we don't hold space for the victims and them trying to leave because we all know that the most dangerous time for a woman is when she's trying to leave her abuser, right? So we can't, how can I say that? Because it also happened in Virginia, right? A former elected official or elected official adjacent was accused of rape a couple of years ago, and his wife has been trying to leave him, and she finally, like, one of her last text messages was like it's we're about to be done, and he set up a trap. He turned off the Wi-Fi in their house. He knew that she would have to restore it for their kids because they were at home, and he killed her and killed himself, right? Under the threat of losing his access and control and power over her. And that is no different than the police state, and that is no different than the prison system that we are operating within, because it is a business for people. It is a way to control um, people of society that have been deemed undesirable by various groups. And that is what we are navigating within. Like, it's very difficult to envision progress in a society that is so deeply rooted in anti-Blackness and um, and just designed around and against oppressed people from all walks of life. And I think the first step is calling a spade a spade. The first step is amplifying the people who are already doing the work. Because one thing about Maryland is that we have brilliant activists in almost every aspect of oppression that you could possibly imagine. We have brilliant activists in the data center space, fighting back against digital redlining and fighting against, environmental racism. And we have brilliant activists in the space who are, pushing back against police brutality. Wherever there is a disparity or there is a hub of violence, you can find a group there. Right after Freddie Gray, a group rose in Baltimore to be able to push back against what police brutality looks like in Baltimore because of the racial and economic disparities there. In Prince George's County, you're pushing off, or excuse me, you have people pushing back against data centers, right? So there are a lot of brilliant activists in that space. What we need is consolidation, and they need amplification and money. Like, you're only as successful as you're funded. You're only as impactful as you're funded. You're only as, like, with running a campaign, right? Like, you see all these ads, um, you see all these mailers that people put out, like, and that's how you quote unquote build name recognition. The same applies for getting buy-in from people who care about it, not because it relates to them, not because they know someone who's experiencing these like chinks in the system, but because they care about humanity overall. That's the baseline. You have to get people to care first before anything can change.
Exactly. 100%. Which brings me to my last talking point for you. And I want to hit on Black maternal health and
Mm-hmm.
how incredibly crucial this is to understand how complex this is too. And if it, again, you know, I hit hard on healthcare. Healthcare and violence prevention are my top two things that I talk about the most. Add in
Mm-hmm.
a little bit of like DHS, add in a little bit about public education. It's all connected. It all ties in together. Because how do we get people in our healthcare system? They go to school, right? We need to make it affordable so we become our next generation leaders, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's all connected and it all trickles down. But Black maternal health, um, this is something that is not talked about in the headlines. This is something that is not talked about nearly enough at all, and it's something that I've made it a personal mission of mine to talk about more and to uplift and to advocate for.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that has hit a lot of my friends very,
Mm-hmm.
very deeply and very hard. One of my friends was shot and killed a couple years ago, and she was
Mm-hmm.
trying to start a family. And she always told me, she was like, I deal with a lot of like health issues. I deal with this, I deal with that. And I was like, damn. She was like, yeah. Like she's like, yeah, you can understand, or I can't understand, but you know what I mean. Um, but I can advocate and I can use my platform and I can use my voice. And I think that's just as powerful as being on the front line. And thinking about Black maternal health, what's your thoughts around this and how has it impacted your district? And
Mm-hmm.
thinking about like the country as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
just let's talk about this for a second and this will be, the next to last question.
Yeah, I mean, I think amplification has immense value, so don't discredit it, right? Especially when you have a platform because you don't know what you don't know, right? And if anyone even listens to like 10 minutes of the conversation, they would have learned something about who you are, not only as a person, but where your values lie. And sometimes that inspires people to also care about certain things because there are a lot more curious people out there than we give people credit for. Because if there weren't, then we wouldn't have all those freaking conspiracy theories on YouTube, right? Like people are inherently regardless of their education level, people are inherently curious. And so when you create opportunities for conversations to develop, that is what you are creating. And that's what you're feeding into is that curiosity. Now, how they gravitate towards it, I don't know. But the point is it has to be out there in the public sphere or the conversation space for people to even begin to give a damn about anything, to be curious about that something they don't interact with. Like I don't have a child. I've not been in that position, but I do know that wealth will never absolve you of racism and its impacts in the medical field, right? Even Beyonce and Serena Williams, right? And everyone, for the most part, knows who those two women are, were not heard when they were trying to get medical help, right? So it's like you cannot be shielded from malicious intentions, regardless of your wealth. And so imagine what that's like for someone who does not have Beyonce and Serena Williams money, right? Like they were able to get assistance, but there are millions of more women who are unable to get that assistance. But to ground it in Maryland, um, we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a primary care desert, but we also have an OB-GYN desert. So about 45 to 65% of Prince Georgians actually leave the county for OB-GYN care. And they're starting to get closer to closing that gap. I know a maternal wellness center just opened a couple of weeks back in Prince George's County, but that's not enough, right? So Maryland has a maternal mortality rate of 21 per 100,000 births across all races and ethnicities, but for Black mothers, it's 30 deaths per 100,000 live births, right? So these are not small numbers. When we talk about Black maternal mortality nationally, we know that there's an 80% chance for Black mothers to die. We also know that there's a very high rate of C-sections amongst Black women, which also lead to um, that also lead to complications during death and internal bleeding. And so when we think about Black maternal mortality, we have to call it what it is. And I know I've referenced her before, but like, I think she's an icon. I think she's the moment. I personally think she is the most efficient person in the party, but Lauren Underwood, she has a mommy bus bill that she's been trying to get passed for a couple of years now. She's been able to pull some pieces out and get it funded. Like she got NIH improved funding, I think about $200 million since 2019 to really identify the challenges and inputs that lead to Black maternal mortality. But, you know, there is a more insidious percolating idea, and that's the medical system has never been kind to Black people, but Black women. The father of gynecology experimented on slaves without any type of pain remediation. And that's why we have any type of advancement in gynecological sciences that we have now is because Black bodies were used as experiments. Then you have Tuskegee experiment, you have Henrietta Lacks, you know, like they used her cells to propel massive medical research. And she died in poverty in an unmarked grave. You know what I mean? Like, so this is the thread and the through point of American medical history. And so we're just living in the effects of it today. But in the momnibus, she was also able to get veterans' maternal mortality passed, and that's tethered to defensive spending. But being able to name the problem and capture the nuances of the various rural parts or urban parts across America is the only way that we can really move forward in being able to address um, the communities impacted or Black women, you know, and how they're impacted by, um, you know, medical racism. And I would take it a step further and say fibroids, right? Like in general, women's health is one of the most underinvested areas, irrespective of race, right? Fibroids is significantly underfunded, but it disproportionately impacts Black women and Black and brown women to be specific. And they don't have any real data around it. And recently, a doctoral student, I think at Penn, University of Penn, Pennsylvania, determined that depending on the type of surgery you have, whether it's invasive or non-invasive, either they cut you open or they don't cut you open, you have a higher chance of heart disease just from fibroids, right? And she determined that by sifting through years and years and years of data. But to really close the gap in understanding how to address the differences and outcomes for Black women, Latino women, Asian women, white women, you need money, right? And you need to be able to have these researchers thinking in this space. And I'm going to deviate, and you got to walk with me for a second. During Prohibition, people was outside, you know, or before Prohibition, people were outside. Like there were bars lining the street across, you know, Capitol, and they used to go outside and, you know, have their little dilly dallies, their martinis, and their little, you know, fun adventures. And then when Prohibition hit, we lost all of the knowledge around fancy drinks, and we didn't really start getting that back until the next couple of years. So while we're running through all these cuts around federal research and the Department of Education, we're going to lose that knowledge gap because researchers are going to have to leave America to be able to do anything monumental for anybody around the globe because the cuts are so significant. So now we already have these persistent disparities in access to care and access to wellness care after birth. We're going to be further compounded by a research scientist drought. So it's like when we think about everything, we're going to have to curve back to even begin to have a sense of normalcy because the system that is destroyed was not beneficial. It wasn't equitable. It didn't benefit anybody if you looked a certain way. So it's going to be moderately devastating. So people who want to burn shit down, like this is that, and we're living through it, right? It's not going to be a dystopian novel like Hunger Games, where like when Katniss screams, "When you burn, I burn too." Like you know what I mean? Like it's not going to be that. This is the system being burned down, and this is what it looks like when you don't adequately prepare to stave out the fires where they're burning the hottest. And some of the hottest fires are going to be experienced in Maryland because of our proximity to the government and because of our rural communities. So that's my little spiel about that.
Absolutely. You know, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I greatly appreciate this conversation. It's been eye-opening for me. And I'm glad that you do research and that you write these papers because these are so incredibly important in today's society to recognize the ongoing issues that continue to affect marginalized communities, right? So
Mhm.
again, I want to say thank you for everything that you are doing. And I think it is deeply important. I wish you the absolute best in your primary, as I do everybody, because we all deserve that fighting chance, right? And
Yeah.
we need to see a Congress, but not just Congress, like also your local city council, your local water
Hmm.
board. Every single election matters. And I cannot say that
Hmm.
enough. Every single election matters, no matter how big or how small it is. So, again, I want to say thank you. Now, how can people contribute to your campaign? Should they feel compelled to do so? And where can they find you on social media and follow you?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I had a really great time. Sorry for going on tangents. I just look at things from a very macro level because
Mhm.
you have to address the symptom. Like it's like, Malcolm X said it, right? Like if you stab me in the back 8 times and then give me a band-aid for six, like you're not healing me. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of like where we are as a society. Like we can't piecemeal our solutions anymore, because the most vulnerable of us are being, hunted in the streets, theoretically, right? So, and literally, right? But to follow me on social media, it's Shavonne, the number 4 Congress. I thought I was being witty, but it can be a little bit cumbersome sometimes. And for support, I'd love to sign up to volunteer on my website. So we're going door knocking if you're in Maryland. My website is Vote Shavonne for Congress. Now I did spell that out because for some reason Shavonne for Congress was taken and I could not get that domain. But I'm really grateful for the opportunity to chat through and kind of, color in more of why I care about Prince George's County, why I care about the residents of Montgomery County, Maryland, and all across America, because there are a lot of brilliant people running because they care. And so being able to kind of chat through a little more of like my philosophy and why I I talk about things the way I do. It's such an honor, and I'm very grateful to you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And again, I wish you the absolute best. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Wow. Continuing the conversation and
Yeah.
continue uplifting you and, just watching everything that you're doing. It is very inspiring. And I look forward to welcoming you back at some point too and absolutely continuing on the conversation. So again, thank you
Yeah,
so much.
I'd love to chat again. Thank you so much, Zachary. You've been a gem. You're a beautiful soul, and I appreciate what you're doing for all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Bye.